Okay, so tonight we are going to be discussing an article. Um, it I'll confess the article is a little wonky and a little detailed in terms of the history of Jewish law. So I was thinking today as I was watching a little bit of CNN. So I was going to say we have breaking news of a debate, and this news is breaking. And let's see the time that it broke. Oh, it's about 1,000 years ago, but we'll still consider it breaking news. Probably not quite 1,000 years ago, a few hundred years ago. Um, um, so the issue is, well, the article is called "Tabernacle Sacrifices and Judaism: Maimonides versus Nachmanides." So I want to introduce it in a couple of ways. First, who is Maimonides and who is Nachmanides? Um, the in the world of rabbinics, the rabbis love to have abbreviations for people's names. So, and I would say, it's the same sort of thing that where we refer to John Fitzgerald Kennedy as JFK and RFK and FDR and so on. So Maimonides is Moshe ben Maimon, and I don't know the exact rule on how they get to Maimonides. Another abbreviation for Maimonides is Rambam.
Yes.
Rambam is actually I can't remember the English word for it, but it's like NASA. It's Rambam is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. It's like NASA. The initial letters of that phrase. So Maimonides is about 1,000 years ago. And the thing to keep in mind about Maimonides is he is a rationalist. And he's always described as being Aristotelian and philosophical. And he was a full-time physician, in addition to being, arguably one of the preeminent scholars and commentators on almost everything in the Bible and everything in the Talmud. Maimonides is commenting. And then the other very important thing about Maimonides is to sort of keep in mind, is he also writes an extensive code of Jewish law. And I think a lot of what we're going to be reading are quotes from what he calls Mishnah Torah. And it only took me a year or two to figure out the difference between the Mishnah and Mishnah Torah.
Wow.
So, um, so
Enlighten us, please.
yes. So at the heart, okay, first let's take Mishnah. Mishnah is written down in the year 200, and it is an attempt by the leading rabbi, 200 Common Era, by the leading rabbi of the time to record the oral law, because there was such a fear that if we don't write it down, we're going to lose it. Because by the year 200, the rabbis were being significantly harassed by the Romans, and the schools were being disrupted, and this memorization of all the oral law was being interfered with. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi writes down what he considers to be the most important part of the oral law in a book called the Mishnah. And then for the next few hundred years, the rabbis comment and discuss the Mishnah. Their commentary is called the Gemara, and the Mishnah plus the Gemara equals the Talmud. That's Mishnah. And the Mishnah means repetition. So it's like a repetition of the law. The Mishnah Torah is a code of law written by Maimonides. I can't remember the exact dates for Maimonides, but it's about 1,000 years ago or so. And he's just a brilliant scholar. And there are a number of other codes of law that existed before then. And I think we've discussed this. The reason you need a code of law is the Talmud reads like a free association discussion of things. And it's enormous. A Talmud, even without translation and commentary and so on, is 12, 13, 14 volumes. And to know where things are, you really have to know the entire Talmud, because stuff comes up along the way in arguments. So if you're just a simple, rabbi, and you wanna get the rules about lighting Hanukkah candles, If you don't know, or Hanukkah lamps in ancient times, if you don't know that that discussion is in Tractate Shabbat, you're going to be lost. Um, and they're, these are all handwritten scrolls. So these are scrolls that are sitting on your shelf. And so what happens, I think, starting probably 7th, 8th century Common Era, people start writing codes of law. So they gather all of the information, let's say about Hanukkah in one section, Shabbat in one section, rules of fighting war in one section, rules of the king in another section, rules of kashrut, and so on and so on and so on. And Maimonides it's what I would say is for his time certainly is the most authoritative code of law, and he just decides what's right and what's wrong. The other previous codes of law might present both sides. Maimonides just says he gives his answer to the discussion. So that's Maimonides, and the Mishnah Torah means repetition or of the Torah. Yeah, Alan.
When you said this was kind of creating on written down codes, it reminded me of the topic we discussed called the Shulchan Aruch.
Yes.
And just to remind me, I looked up the Mishkan Torah and it says 1170 CE
Right,
approximately.
that sounds right. Mm-hmm.
And now the Shulchan Aruch was approximately when?
1500.
Okay, so
and
within,
that's go ahead.
no, I was trying to, from the year 200 to almost 1,000 years later, people were still working with the original materials, but the formalities must not have happened in different documents.
Well, there are other codes of law. There's Arba Turim. There are 3 or 4 other codes of law that are helpful to rabbis in towns, because not every rabbi is going to be a Talmudic scholar. And sometimes people just go to the rabbi with a fairly simple, straightforward question, and the rabbi needs something to look up. The significance of the Shulchan Aruch, which is about 1500, is it's the first code of law after the invention of movable type. So because it could be printed, every rabbi in every town would have a copy. And so that makes it particularly significant. But so that's Rambam. Rambam, Maimonides, rationalist, a philosopher, student of Aristotle, wrote in Arabic, wrote in Hebrew. That's Maimonides. Now we have Nachmanides. I can't remember what Nachmanides stands for. Moshe, no, I actually don't remember what Nachmanides stands for. But actually Sonia is a descendant of Nachmanides, which is a pretty, that's good, what we call yichus. Now he is a mystic, and he's living in Spain, I think in the 13 or 1400s. You can check it. One of his notable events in history is he accepts a challenge to debate Judaism versus Catholicism in Spain, I think in Barcelona, maybe not. Anyway, in Spain, and he debates a Jew that had converted to Christianity in front of the King of Spain, and he made one big mistake. He won the debate, and he had to flee for his life after winning that debate. I'm sure I'm oversimplifying it. That would actually be another interesting topic.
Probably so did the loser.
That's probably true. It's very true. Yeah. So, but he is a mystic, and his writings, as you'll see, very early on in this article, deal with the 10 Sefirot, and so they're very different. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of like Erwin's presence here, and to some degree Paul's presence here, sort of with an instinct for very traditional approach to Judaism, and certainly my approach is not so traditional. So that's kind of the fun of this discussion. And so the interesting question, and I can tell with this extended introduction, we're never going to finish the article tonight. But the interesting question
There's
is
an article?
Yes, there is an article. the interesting question is, as discussed in the article, what's the purpose of sacrifices?
Yeah,
Does God need the sacrifices, or are the sacrifices for our benefit? Is it purely psychological? And I have to admit, the other day when we were on, a few weeks ago, on Torah study, and Bryce was there, and we had a discussion which was very similar to this on the question of commandments, because in the Torah there is a long list of blessings and curses about what will happen if you obey the commandments or you disobey the commandments. And Bryce represented what I would say is an extreme perspective, but not an inappropriate perspective, is that it's a little bit like a protection racket. Like the old story, back in the mafioso coming to the candy store owner and say, it would sure be, unfortunate if your candy store happened to burn down. Fortunately, I can help guarantee that that's not going to happen. And I guess I thought a lot about that, and the only a counterexample or the main counter argument I would have to that particular argument is, presumably the commandments are for our benefit, not for God's benefit. If the candy store owner is paying, $100 a week or $100 a month, that's clearly for the mafia's benefit. But if we're eating, I mean, to use two extremes or two kinds of commandments, if we're giving money to the poor, if we're protecting the widow and the orphan and so on, that's the benefit of humanity. Interesting question whether it benefits God. And you can even then start to question what's the benefit to humanity of eating kosher. But the question actually is, does God really need us to obey the commandments, or is God basically a teacher encouraging us to obey the commandments for our own good? And lo and behold, almost the next day, I saw this article, which addresses what I would say, broadly speaking, is a similar subject. So I'm just curious, before I dive into it, whether what you're thinking is both on the ancient sacrificial system and the commandment system. Is this for God's benefit? Is this for our benefit? Does God get anything out of our obeying the commandments? And Bryce, I'll let you lead off.
Yeah, so I don't think it's that, it's a simple question to ask, but I don't think that it could possibly have a simple answer. And the reason is that just looking at conscious motivations, okay, and in a simplified form, I don't think captures the nuances of what's going on. When you have a class like the priests and the Levites and the Kohanes who depend upon the community for their sustenance and livelihood,
Mm-hmm.
and that the feedback mechanism is that there must be a godly influence to command people to bring this, and these are the people that are the spokespeople for God. So it's a conflict of interest like you wouldn't believe, all right? And to say, and to cast aspersions on people and to say good, bad is the wrong argument. It's that people tend to find solutions to their problems within their own self-interest, especially as guided by the influences of other people and what people will go along with, tolerate, what the community expects. It becomes a mechanism, it becomes a machine, you see? And so, the benefit of it really is to many parties in many different ways, or
Mm-hmm.
else it wouldn't sustain itself. I don't
And
know.
then, of course, we have the other element is, now once the priesthood is gone, and there is no sort of central, certainly not in Judaism, there is no central element in Judaism that gets a significant measure of support from the community. You can argue maybe the synagogue does, but it's a fairly small amount. And in ancient times, rabbis had day jobs. in addition to whatever the community support. Okay, Paul, and then Erwin.
Yeah, let's take the issue of a farmer who tills his land and rides his tractor to till the land and make the crops grow every 4 times a year. And God says that's what you need to do. And the man who's on the tractor says, I'm not going to do that. The man, it's up to the man it's up to the person to follow what God says. God won't tell you what to do. He will give you an idea of what to do, and it's your job to follow it. That's what I think.
Yeah, and again, I would say, if you're basically you're either working at your job or you're not working at your job, presumably there's a pretty solid feedback loop. But the issue is, let's say, other commandments like support the widow and the orphan. If you don't support the widow and the orphan, presumably that doesn't affect your day-to-day existence. In fact, you can argue that if you cut off those kinds of charities, you'll have a little more money to spend. Erwin.
I think the sacrifice and the smoke which was given out of the sacrifice brought the people closer to God. And now when I pray for thanking God for my meal, I thank God that I have the strength to work and produce that meal on the table, because without my health and my ability, what God gave me, wouldn't be able to produce that meal on the table.
Yeah, that's what I think also. Yeah.
Okay, I am going to pop the article on the screen. Hopefully this will work. And I presume you can see it. Yes, the Torah?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. I can see you. Okay, it's working. Okay, so I'll read the introduction and I'll ask for volunteer readers. Tabernacle sacrifices in Judaism, Maimonides versus Nachmanides. Who needs the tabernacle? What's the purpose of sacrifices? Maimonides and Nachmanides have radically different answers to these questions, reflecting a core debate about the nature of Judaism and the purpose of its rituals. And Menachem Kellner is certainly a scholar that I have heard of. So I know this might be a little small. Let me see if I can make it a little bigger.
It's fine.
Yeah, it depends what kind of screen you have. Okay. So would someone like to read beginning at much of the book of Exodus? Go ahead, Ken.
Okay, much of the book of Exodus is dedicated to the construction of the Mishkan tabernacle. Moses is told to have the tabernacle and its implements constructed out of expensive materials and to place it in the very center of the Israelite camp. What was the Mishkan for? Moses Maimonides and Moses Nachmanides express two very different approaches to its meaning. In order to understand the nature of this debate, I start with their debate over the nature of sacrifices.
Okay, please continue.
Sacrifices, Maimonides versus Nachmanides. For Maimonides, the sacrifices were simply a device to wean the Israelites away from idolatry and nothing more. Sacrifices were not part of God's ideal plan, as it were, but were forced on God by the primitive nature of the Israelites leaving Egypt. The familiar mode of worship, the way of life we grew up in, prevalent throughout the world in those days, just meant sacrificing various animals in the temples where those images were erected, bowing down to them and burning incense before them. The pious and devout in those days worshipped only in temples dedicated to the stars, as I explained. So, with the wisdom and grace evident throughout creation, God did not decree that his law simply annul, reject, and abolish all such worship. From Guide of the Perplexed.
Yeah, let me just mention this book of Maimonides, very influential, called The Guide to the Perplexed, The Guide of the Perplexed. Maimonides, again, is an Aristotelian logical philosopher, so he is going to try and do what we would call theology. He is going to try and explain the basis of Judaism to people who are puzzled about Judaism. I actually have a copy of this. I haven't really studied it, but I'm led to understand it's a very difficult book to read. And somebody says I've heard it said the introduction is so difficult that it's designed to discourage anyone who's not up to sort of snuff in philosophy from trying to go further. But basically, what Maimonides is doing in this book is giving us perplexed souls that wonder about Judaism a guide to help us understand why Judaism is the way it is. Paul.
Yeah, I just noticed a word there that is that has the quotation marks forced around it. There it is. But we're forced on God by the primitive nature of the Israelites leaving in Egypt. What does the word forced have?
So to summarize basic Maimonides approach, we're going to see a lot of discussion of this. Maimonides basically is not in favor of animal sacrifices. It's a primitive form of worship. I think his overall logic is, and this is generally what you see when what I see when when folks are discussing the book of Leviticus in our Saturday morning Torah study. We've been in Leviticus now. We've just left it, but we've been in it for many months, and it's filled with animal sacrifice discussion. And so I would say the normative Jewish understanding of animal sacrifices is, up until this point in Jewish history, the Exodus, the only way anybody ever worshipped any god was through sacrificing stuff to that god. That was the way you worshipped gods. So if Judaism all of a sudden showed up with a completely and radically different way of worshiping God, such as prayer,
yes,
that would be so radically different that everybody would think it was nuts. So therefore, what Maimonides overall says is, because we're so, as humans, this is the way every human would worship any god. So the Jewish system is going to adopt that also, but the Jewish system is going to have in it the only place you can do animal sacrifices is at the temple in Jerusalem. And certainly from the perspective of Maimonides, the temple is going to get destroyed, so we will have to go to a different system. So that's Maimonides' overall idea. God is forcing us into this sacrificial system, knowing that it will become impossible to continue, and that we'll move on into prayer.
And because you could change that word "forced" with a question, with a quotation marks around it, as it is, but were what worshipped God by primitive nature of the Israelites leaving Egypt. Could you?
What he's saying is sacrifices weren't part of God's.
Forced.
Yeah. So remember, God is a commander.
Right.
They have commandments. These are commandments. They're not suggestions. They're not options. They're commandments.
Right.
So you could certainly argue, we can quibble with the term forced, but basically what Maimonides is saying is the people were so primitive that the initial way to worship God, to serve God, was going to be the way every people served its own gods. Alan.
I'm thinking about when you made it sound like when the temple was destroyed, the people were just as disrupted or unable to appreciate, to deal with it. Just like the Israelites, when they left Egypt, were told in the book of Exodus that it took an entire generation to be away from slavery for the people to be other than slaves.
Right.
So during the period from year 70 to 200, was there a phenomenon going on like that where the generations were traumatized by the experience, similar to the Exodus?
So because no one's really written the history of that time, we really don't know.
Not Josephus, that story is not,
Um,
doesn't.
I mean, Josephus,
The thesis,
I don't
sorry.
know that he goes much beyond the destruction of the temple.
Okay.
But by and large, people weren't writing histories in those days. So we really don't know. And remember, most Israelites didn't live close to Jerusalem. They might make a pilgrimage, ideally, 4 times a year. Um, but it's very hard to say how much the temple sacrificial system was part of the average Israelite's life. Um, and of course, the myth is that we had in place the oral law that would take the place of the sacrificial system, and prayer would take the place
Right. That's
of the
right.
sacrificial system.
That's right.
And ultimately, this is what the rabbis are doing with the destruction of the temple. They are basically reforming Judaism, choosing my words very carefully, from a religion based on animal sacrifice to a religion based on prayer and study of sacred text, and obedience to commandments.
That's the right.
Erwin.
That's how I see it. Yes.
Yeah, Rabbi, can you explain to me the temple was destroyed, so we stopped sacrificing and we switched to prayer. During World War II, temples were destroyed, but the Jews still remained praying and
Yeah.
obeying the
Yes.
pastor.
So temples
So
weren't destroyed.
nobody, no,
Hold
let
on.
me finish.
Oh, sorry.
Nobody forced you to pray. Nobody forced you to pray, but they still did.
So
Right.
let me answer the question. Temples weren't destroyed. Synagogues were destroyed.
A synagogue. Okay.
There was only one temple, and the purpose of the temple was animal sacrifice, not prayer. So once the temple is destroyed, and with the words in the book of Deuteronomy that you will only sacrifice in the place where God will cause his name to dwell, which is understood to be the temple in Jerusalem, there is no way to do animal sacrifice anymore. So the rabbis switch over to a system. The word we use is synagogue, which is a Greek word meaning meeting place. The Hebrew word for a synagogue is Beit Knesset, which means the house of meeting. So basically, with the destruction of the temple, you don't need any special place at all to pray. You can pray wherever there are 10 adult males. You can say prayers. So, in fact, the Yiddish term shul means school. So people would pray in schools.
You can't pray in a bathroom or a couple of
Yeah. Yes. You're not supposed to pray in a dirty place. But the point is, you don't need to go to Jerusalem to pray.
Yeah, I got that.
But you can pray in a concentration camp.
Yes, they did.
And they did. So it really, if a synagogue is destroyed, you pray wherever you can pray.
Yes, Rabbi. When before you pray alone, you say El Melech Ne'aman, and you can do your prayers.
All right, so I'm not going to get into details of liturgy, but basically, certain prayers you don't say when you don't have a minyan. I'm now talking about traditional Judaism. Certain prayers you say silently, but I'm not going to get into that. That really is off the subject. Hey, Ken, would you like to continue with Moreover, Maimonides?
Moreover, Maimonides explains the details of sacrificial law, such as the choice of which animals to sacrifice.
Erwin, I'm going to mute Erwin. Go ahead.
Okay, as merely the way God decided to wean Israel away from the idolatrous society in which they had lived. The Torah, as Ankylos reads it, tells us clearly that the ancient Egyptians worshipped the constellation Aries, so they prohibited slaughtering sheep and abominated shepherds. Beyond that, some Sabian sects worshipped jinn and believed they took a goat form. That is why they called jinn fawns. Such beliefs were quite widespread in the days of our teacher Moses. No more shall they sacrifice to goats. So these sects forbade eating goat meat, and slaughtering cattle was abhorrent to nearly all pagans. They all venerated these beasts. So you'll find even today that Hindus never slaughter cattle, even in lands where other beasts are slaughtered. To blot out all the trace of such unsound beliefs, then, we were commanded to sacrifice animals of these three kinds specifically, of the herd and flock, of the herd and flock.
But what Maimonides is saying is one of the purposes of the sacrifices was to take animals that were forbidden to be sacrificed in Egypt and other cultures and being commanded to sacrifice them as I'll say Jews, but technically the Israelites are going to sacrifice animals that other traditions would not sacrifice. Again, it's a way of separating us from the rest of the world.
Maimonides continues in this vein, arguing that the sacrificial law was useful at the time for combating idolatrous beliefs. Presumably, these rules became obsolete over time as society changed, even if they remained in force as long as the temple stood.
Okay, so that's Maimonides' point of view. There was a time when there was going to do this, temple's not standing anymore, and these rules would become obsolete. So now we're going to hear from Nachmanides.
Nachmanides rejected this claim in intemperate language in his commentary to Leviticus 1:9. But these are mere expressions, healing casually a severe wound and a great difficulty, and making the table of the eternal polluted, as if the offerings were intended only to remove false beliefs from the hearts of the wicked and fools of the world.
So he's saying there's a deeper reason here.
Instead, Nachmanides insisted that sacrifices had both psychological value, something Maimonides could accept, and also, and more fundamentally, cosmic theurgical significance.
I guess theurgical, I'm not even sure.
Yeah.
From the context, that word means that there's a cosmic theological significance to the sacrifices themselves. So we're going to get into a little bit of what he means by that. The sin of Eden.
Sin of Eden, Maimonides versus Nachmanides. Nachmanides' understanding of the purpose of sacrifices connects to his understanding of human history, specifically the sin of Adam and Eve, which he believed caused a cosmic breach. In Kabbalistic terms, this original sin sundered.
And I'll tell you that the Hebrew is chet kadmoni.
Okay. Thank you. Sundered the Sifirot of Shekinah and Tiferet. The commandments of Judaism are first and foremost a divine need, Zorek Gavoha, to repair this breach in the cosmos.
Okay, I'm just going to show you an image of the Sfirot. So first, let me know if you can see it now.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Not the whole thing.
No, I know. It's so actually, I'll shrink it a little bit so you can see the whole thing. There we go. Okay, there's just about all of it.
Yeah, just about.
Okay. So basically, you will hear this term, and there's lots of different images of the Sefirot, and this is actually from Sefaria. But if you study Kabbalah, you'll see this kind of thing all the time. And basically, I studied this and studied this and studied this, and I have just the barest understanding of it. So my understanding of it is as follows. For real understanding, consult your neighborhood Kabbalist and probably Chabad rabbi. So the Bible says that humanity was created in the image of God, right? You remember this. So, whenever we study that, I always ask the question, what does that say about God? And what does that say about us? Well, what the Kabbalists say, and they derive this from their study of the Zohar, the central text of Jewish mysticism, is that just as a human being has different parts, so too does God have different parts. And the word Sfirot comes from the word to count. So there's 10 of them. And so I often say, those of us that sort of, poo-poo the idea in Christianity that God is threefold should at least admit that from the Kabbalist point of view, God is tenfold. So I'm going to zoom in on this so you can see it a bit better. So at the highest element of God is Keter, which means crown, and it's nothing, meaning no thing. There is no thing, physical thing, either here or above. Above this sometimes is called the Ein Sof, which means without end. So the Kabbalists talk about this being the will of God, the ayin, or nothing. And then, just like we have a right side and a left side, so in this Sephirotic description, God has a right side and a left side, and the side we're seeing here is the right side, is the male side, and so this Sephirah is Chachma, which means wisdom, and it's a point and it's a beginning, and that point is implanted in Bina, the female side, which can mean understanding, and it can represent the womb. And then as we go on, we have love, the right arm of God, and we have power, and there are colors associated with it, and the power is on the female side, which is interesting. They all then combine into Tiferet, which is actually splendor, the word Tiferet, but it's also called Rachamin and compassion, the Blessed Holy One, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, heaven, sung, harmony, king, and so on. And then there are legs, a right leg and a left leg. And then there's Yesod, which is phallus, which is the male element of God. And then below that is the Shekhinah. Shekhinah is a feminine aspect of God, and also that part of God which has a presence on the earth. So what
we're looking at God, we're looking at God from behind.
Yes, well, we're looking at God from face on, I would say.
No,
because the right
left is on left and
yeah. Okay.
So it's flipped. Then we're looking at if we're looking at God's right arm, we're looking at the backside of God.
Okay. Yes, God is facing away from us. Yes. So then there's other ways of looking at it. This is an endless subject. But what the interesting thing that's going on here is Maimonides is talking about the sin in the garden as original sin. And you will hear lots of people, including me, say that original sin really doesn't have a place in Judaism in the same way that it has a place in Christianity, where original sin is understood to be the abiding sin that infects all of us. But what he is saying is that sin separated the Sephirot of Shekhinah and Tiferet. So basically, the sin separated the unity of God from Tiferet and Shekhinah. So that's what sort of this cosmic idea, certainly in Kabbalah, that sin, that one of the goals of Kabbalah is to reunify God. And we have a prayer, at the end of the service, which says, B'yom hahu, on that day, Yihya Adonai echad, God will be one, Ushemo echad. And I think that's a Kabbalistic idea that we're trying to unify the Sfirot. And in particular, we have a separation between Tiferet and Shekhinah. So we want to unify God's male and female aspects. And if you look actually in Art Scroll prayer books, before people put on a talit, before they put on tefillin, they will, kind of utter a little incantation saying, I'm doing this in the name of unifying God's male and female aspects, Yud Hey with Vav Hey. So it gets, I certainly don't want to get into the details of this, but the point that Nachmanides is making is that the sacrifices have a role in unifying God. They're not just being done because everybody else used to do it. And, in the idea of Maimonides is trying to wean us off this, but they actually have a role in unifying God. Bryce.
Yeah, so I'm a little confused when you
Oh,
say
you
the
should be. I'm a
no,
little confused, and I've been studying this for 20 years.
well, I understand. What I'm a little I'm when I say I'm a little confused, I'm being a little understated. Um, the thing that I find confusing is this idea, my first question to you is when you say, when Nachmanides says original sin in the Garden of Eden, what sin is that?
Violating God's commandment not to eat the fruit.
So that means that the power to sunder God rested in the hand of Adam, God's creation,
Yes.
which to me is a bridge too far.
Okay. And I would say um, that you're taking a more rationalist approach. But one of the things that I will say about um, Kabbalah, which you may actually like it, but you got to think about what it really means, is God cannot create the world that God wants without the participation of humanity. And one way of describing that is God, God's self, I'm trying not to use himself, God's self is in some way not completely whole because of the role of sinfulness in the world. And that God is depending on us to restore that wholeness uh, to the world. And God can't do it alone.
And
And I,
this is the world that God created.
yes, God
All
deliberately
right.
created a
All
world
right.
where, I mean, in some ways, we have children, hoping that our children will make a better world than the one we have. So you can call it projection, but what I would say is that to me is one of the most fascinating and outrageous understandings in Kabbalah. I'm going to go back to the article. I presume you can see the article. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. So Ken, why don't you pick up right here? Here again.
Here again, the contrast with Maimonides is stark. For Maimonides, the manifest content of the early Genesis stories are not to be taken literally. They don't teach us the actual history of the universe. While the latent meaning of the creation story teaches us principles of physics, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden is an allegorical explanation of the human condition. Maimonides himself stopped short of presenting this approach openly, but Rabbi Joseph Kafi, the great Maimonidean translator, expositor, and member of the Rabbinic High Court in Jerusalem, no trafe academic he, elucidates Maimonides' point. Our teacher Maimonides brought a realistic explanation for why women light Sabbath candles. He ignored the language of the Midrash in accordance with his position that the entire description of Adam and Eve and the snake in Genesis chapter 2 is couched in allegorical terms, as he wrote in Guide 30, it is not Eve, the actual woman, who caused death to Adam. See there.
Basically,
Um,
Maimonides takes an approach that I would certainly take. I don't read the story of the Garden of Eden as being literal human history. I take it as an allegory. Um, but Nachmanides, as we will see, is going to take it much more literally.
For Maimonides, there was no fall, no original sin, no cosmic tearing, and consequently, no need to help put God back together, as it were. Maimonides' God is transcendent. Maimonides' fundamental problem as a religious philosopher is to connect that God to the history of the Jewish people and the mitzvot of the Torah. In other words, his problem was to move the unmoved mover of Aristotelian philosophy. The God of Nachmanides, in contrast, is immanent in the world and has needs that only the Jewish people can satisfy. Nachmanides' problem is to connect the most moved mover, as Abraham Heschel, Joshua Heschel famously put it, to the God who created the entire cosmos.
I mean, I will point out something that I'm even a little embarrassed about. I was once in a Delta lounge, probably in New York, wait a long layover for a flight, and I'm sitting, in the lounge. I probably have my yarmulke on, and a Chabadnik or a Chassid, I'm not sure he's Chabad or not, comes and asks me if I've put on tefillin today.
The way you
And
can tell is that the Kabadniks dress like other houses, but don't have payout.
okay, so anyway, this person asked me if I had put on tefillin today, and I said no, and he wanted me to do it, and I just didn't want to do it, and I said, yeah, I understand, the idea that it's going to heal the universe, and and I was not sufficiently sensitive to him. I probably just should have lied and said I did. Um, but from the Chabadnik's point of view, my not putting on tefillin actually has an effect on the entire universe and the path to wholeness. And certainly that's not a position that I would accept. Yeah, Alan.
I'm reminded of what Rabbi Josh Weinberg says when asked that by one of the Chabad rabbis in the street, is he responds by saying, "No, I didn't, but my wife did it for us today."
Yeah, that's going one level of nastiness that even I wouldn't descend to. Although I
Yeah.
once, I bought a set of tefillin for a woman, actually a lesbian woman once when I was in Israel, and if I had told the store that I was buying this tefillin for a woman and a lesbian woman, no less, they would have thrown me out. But
No, but Rabbi, you say it like this. You say, I'm buying this tefillin for a woman. And she go, and you go, no, that's okay. She's a lesbian.
right.
I took a class on how to lay tefillin, and then I was going to Israel, so I got in touch with Cantor in my synagogue about buying a set of tefillin, and he sent me to the conservative movement, okay, in Israel, and I almost bought them. I got a scheduling problem, but you know what? I don't think I would have used it regularly. You use it regularly, Rabbi, don't you?
No, I don't.
You don't. Oh, I thought you did at one point, maybe.
At one point, well, when I was in the year of mourning for my father, but the
Yeah.
tefillin I have are my bar mitzvah tefillin, so they're small and they're not adult size. Okay, let's continue. Ken.
You've previously said you weren't religious as a kid at all, so how do you have bar mitzvah
Sorry?
tefillin? You've previously said that your family didn't practice anything except
Oh, but
for
they sent me to Hebrew school to be bar mitzvah. So
okay.
in Hebrew school, and it was a conservative Hebrew school, they taught us how to use tefillin, and we had to buy a set of tefillin.
Okay.
And actually, one beautiful memory I have of my father, and I realize I have the memory because it's in a home movie, is probably the day of my bar mitzvah. I'm at home and I'm by the dining room table, and I have my tefillin on, and my father is standing proudly beside me, and his uncle is also there, and they're watching me read, I don't know, some prayer or something. So it's a beautiful memory for me. So let's continue. Application to sacrifices.
Application to sacrifices. This goes a long way toward explaining why Nachmanides reacted so strongly against Maimonides' view of sacrifices. For Maimonides, God has no need of burnt offerings or worship sites. These are all for the benefit of humanity. For Nachmanides, however, the sacrificial cult plays a crucial role in satisfying the divine need. He affirms this in his commentary on Leviticus 1:9, where introducing a Kabbalistic idea, he says, by way of truth, there is a hidden secret contained in the offerings. Nachmanides hints at the meaning of the hidden secret in the continuation of his commentary, namely that the secret of the offerings is that they satisfy a divine need. Purpose of the Mishkan, the view of Nachmanides. With this background, we may now ask finally, what is the purpose of the Mishkan in the wilderness? It is fair to say that in contemporary traditionalist Judaism, the view expressed by Nachmanides dominates. Let us therefore look at his view first. He clarifies his position in his comment on the verse. Exodus 29:46. And they shall know that I, Adonai, am their God, who brought them out from the land of Egypt, that I might abide among them, I, Adonai, their God.
So this is
Nachmanides
commenting
writes,
on the establishment of the Mishkan.
Nachmanides writes, there is in this matter a great secret. For in the plain sense of things, it would appear that the dwelling of the divine glory, Hashakina, in Israel was to fulfill a need below, but it is not so. It fulfilled a need above, as in the meaning of Scripture, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. And Joshua said, for when the Canaanites hear of it and cut off our name from the earth, and what will you do for your great name? The word Mishkan is formed from the root
Shin Kaf Nun.
meaning to dwell. According to Nachmanides, God desires to live in the world generally, but needs to dwell in one place more than all others, among the Israelites, in the land of Israel generally, and specifically in the temple. The verse explains that owing to this desire on God's part, there was a need to redeem the Israelites from Egypt, for God could not dwell in their midst so long as they were still slaves and deep in what tradition would have called the 49th level of impurity. The late Rabbi Aharon Lichtenstein makes this point explicitly based on his reading of the sages. God desires to live in the world generally, but he wants to dwell in one place more than all others, among Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, or Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, in the temple. The verse explains that owing to this desire on God's part, there was a need to redeem Bnei Yisrael from Egypt, for God could not dwell in their midst so long as they were still enslaved and mired in the 49th level of impurity.
No idea what the 49th level of impurity refers to. Sorry.
Yeah. It is a sign of how deeply Kabbalah and Hasidism have influenced contemporary Judaism that for many in our world, the notion of God's needs without even the reservation, kaviyakol, as it were, will not be surprising. Abraham Joshua Heschel traces the idea to the school of Rabbi Akiva and finds opposition to it in the school of Rabbi Ishmael. But be that as it may, Nachmanides and his followers had rabbinic warrant for the idea.
So as we're reading this, we'll continue a little more. But as we're reading this, it strikes me even in present day Judaism, we pray toward the Temple Mount. So there is this sense of that, the holiness there, or there's something magical or particularly sacred or holy about the Temple Mount. And you may know that even when, times are sufficiently peaceful for people to go up on the Temple Mount, traditional Jews don't go up on the Temple Mount because we're not 100% sure where the Holy of Holies stood. And that area is forbidden to anyone but, the priest and the high priest. And also, that we don't have sufficient ways of purifying ourselves to be on that site. Never mind that the temple hasn't stood since the year 70. There is still in contemporary Judaism a sense that of all the places in the world, Israel is the holiest, Jerusalem is the holiest of that, the Temple Mount area is the holiest, the Holy of Holies is the most holy. So there is this sense that although, I would say from a philosophical point of view, God is everywhere and you can worship God everywhere. there is still something astoundingly sacred about that particular spot. Bryce.
Yeah, I'm rather suspicious of of anyone, not a person necessarily, but any source telling me that that I must do something because God needs me to do it, and that I have an obligation to God to do what this source is telling me that God wants me to do.
That's
And
interesting.
that's really suspicious to me.
I kind of, I think of John F. Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Ask not what, that the United
And
States
I'm
can do
going
for
to
the
tell you what you can do for your country.
less.
Yeah, I have a little problem with when they're saying that God needs this.
Exactly, Les. I'm with you.
My thought of God
I'm
is
not saying it. I'm saying Nachmanides is saying it, and the Kabbalists are saying it.
I'm not saying that you're saying. I'm just saying I
Right,
have
right.
problem with that
Yes.
because they're defining a God that when I was younger I thought was omnipotent, still believe it, omniscient, and still believe it. And I've made this point many times. I don't think that God. I think when you say God can't, I don't believe that at all. I think God chooses not to. That's the God I worship because if God can't do this and He can't do that, then is He really God? And
And he's a
that
what God? I'm sorry, I
is He
missed it.
really God then? I mean, God to us and when I grew up, and I think most of us when we were in, I wasn't able to go through bar mitzvah or anything because our rabbi kicked us out because my parents got divorced and we couldn't pay the bill. So that was a hard time for us. So I never got bar mitzvah there. I did a b'nai mitzvah at our temple. But the God I worship and the God I've been trained to love and care about is an all loving God, an all powerful God, an all knowing God. And as I get older, I mean, there's things that I could know, but I choose not to. There's things I could do, but I choose not to. And that's how I picture God. And I can't imagine this God that says, oh, I need this, I need that, because I've seen needy people. I can't worship a needy God.
So I'm with you, and I understand that. Um, I have to tell you that Kabbalah is at the opposite extreme. And it's one of the reasons I have problems with Kabbalah. So the question then, that I would ask you is, you're old enough to be familiar with horrible diseases, and I'll just use Huntington's disease. Killed my wife, killed my daughter, my two other children are affected by it. Could God reach in and change the genes of my children?
He could,
Hey,
but he chooses not to because
And
why? I
because,
don't know.
okay, so
someone
that
has
I have a big problem with.
You
50.
don't think God could?
No,
You
I
don't
don't
think
think.
God
No,
could if he chose to?
no, I am with Harold Kushner. I don't believe that God can do that. Whether God, in theory, could do it, but chooses irrevocably not to mess with nature, or whether God is incapable of messing with nature is an interesting fine point, actually, a very important fine point. But I believe no matter how many people pray for that, I don't believe that it would change the genes in my children. And as a sort of proof example, I remember some of us are old enough to remember this.
Mhm.
When John Kennedy was in the White House, his wife had a child, and the child had a horrible medical condition. I don't remember at all what it was. And I have absolutely no doubt that every Catholic in the world, probably just about every Christian, and certainly other people of goodwill, that there were hundreds of millions of people, billions of people, praying for that child, and the child died,
Including the Pope.
including the Pope. Um, at the same time, one of the members of our congregation, Temple of Dad Elohim, later told me that he had a child that was born with the same condition at about the same time, and that child was healed, recovered from the illness. So I do believe that prayer has power, but I don't believe it's that kind of power. But that's my own belief, and it.
Sure.
Could it not be that when we pray to God, it
light something in us to do something about it in our limited capacity.
I absolutely agree with that. And when I pray that doctors will be guided, to cure this disease. But in theory, the God that created the universe could have, adjusted one sperm that created my wife and selected another sperm, and she would have been free of Huntington's disease. The God that created the universe could have caused Mrs. Hitler and Mrs. Eichmann, the parents of those two, to have a spontaneous abortion, and they never would have been born. So anyway, but that's a very we're actually getting into that discussion in the science and religion
somebody else
class.
have done what they did.
Sorry?
If those two individuals were never born, would the things they did still have been done just by someone else?
I don't know. I'm not questioning that. Alan, go ahead.
I want to go back to your John F. Kennedy quote because it caused me to think of maybe a slightly. I agreed with your statement, but let me remind us about the statement from Hillel, which is, "If I am not for
if I'm not for myself,
who will be for me? And if I am not only for me, what am I?" So
right.
that seems is relevant to. I've kind of lost a little track because we kind of went down this other path about. But anyway, the connection. I felt like the Hillel statement about how we look at our responsibility. Hillel makes, I suppose, a little broader sense to me than Kennedy, even though I don't disagree with Kennedy's statement.
Okay, Bryce.
Yeah, so you know that I've spoken with you about this in the past, that the idea of whether God can act in the world, all right, and that if God is in fact omniscient and knows everything about how the world will be, then that makes God incapable of changing what the world will be, and therefore cannot act in it. All right, I mean it's a logical conundrum. We've talked about it before, and the idea that I have extremely emotional reactions to the idea of a God that wants good but won't make it happen.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I would say God wants good, and God makes it happen by inspiring us to do good, but not forcing our hands. And so this really is. I would say it's. I would say it's rational. I mean, certainly Harold Kushner is a rationalist, conservative rabbi, but that's the power of God. He wrote a book called "Who Needs God," and the power of God is not as a magician or as a puppeteer pulling strings, but as a teacher and an inspirer and someone who brings people together to do God's work in the world. But certainly in his sense, and I agree with this, I don't think God is omnipotent in that God can force us to do God's will. God can
exactly. Or God can just change the universe to make something happen. I mean, it makes a farce out of free will.
Yeah, I agree that free will is an important element here. My understanding of this phrase, and we discussed it, I think, in the science religion class. It's in the Mishnah. It says, "All is foreseen, yet free will is given." And on one level, that's a logical impossibility. The way I understand it is God is outside of time, so we have free will. We can actually make decisions about what we're going to do, yet because God sees in the future, God knows the results of what our decisions will be.
Well, then it doesn't make any difference about what we think we're deciding because it's already foreseen.
So I would say, in basically in mathematical terms, Bryce, I would say God is in a fourth or fifth dimension. There are things that you remember Flatlands by Abbott, right?
Sure.
Yeah, there are things that are impossible in Flatlands, turning a left shoe into a right shoe, which are easy if you have a third dimension. So I would say what's going on here is God is outside the dimension of time and space. Less.
It's like, if I'm reading a book and I'm partway in it and I want to know how it ends, I choose not to. That's how I see God. He just chooses not to see the end, and he's along for the ride. And part of me thinks that God gets a kick out of watching us, not choosing not to know what we do. And it's kind of like us watching a television program or a series or something. And that to me kind of helps me understand the omnipotence and omniscient and just choosing not to. That's the only way I can deal with it.
So the way I think about it is like watching a movie. And I'm much more rational than my wife about stuff like this, and she has a much higher sense of empathy than I do. When she watches a movie, I mean, she is really moved and upset by, scenes of fighting and gore and stuff like that. And, my worldview is it's just a movie, it's not real. Um, and there are certain movies that are highly suspenseful. And, my way of thinking is that the end of this movie is already determined. It's not, there's no uncertainty about it. I may not know how it's going to end, but the people that made the movie know how it's going to end. So you can say all is foreseen. The movie maker knows what happened, but inside the movie, the characters act as though they have free will. So that's sort of my projection. Hold on, Alan, and then Bryce.
So Rabbi, on the same spirit, because if I'm watching TV and I switch from one of those dramas, especially the crime-oriented ones, and I switch to the news, and now it's not fiction, do you get into a different frame of mind because the real world is sort of like
yeah,
except it's worse.
Yes, it is worse.
Yeah, there was something. I mean, look, chase scenes can be very exciting and interesting, even though you've seen it 10 times, right? I mean, there are probably some movies you've watched many times, and you can still get into it and even cry, being very into it. One of the things I find absolutely fascinating about human psychology is how the dullest chase scene live, with the helicopters following this idiot who's weaving in and out of traffic, uh, will, interrupt all the news. I mean, it's sort of astounding. It's kind of like, the most important news element of the day. It's some idiot who just won't let himself be pulled over by the police because we don't know how it's going to end.
You talking about OJ?
OJ,
No, I'm not
yeah.
talking about OJ. I'm talking about just about every night. I mean, I was in a restaurant waiting to pick up some takeout food, and on the screen there was this scene of police chasing this guy. Bryce.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So what when you said that the movie maker knows how the movie's going to end, you see, what's interesting is when the movie maker started making the movie, he may not have known how the movie was going to end.
Maybe not.
Because when you take the movie out and you test the movie, if audiences don't like the ending, the studio would make the filmmaker reshoot a new ending.
Yep. So I don't disagree with that. I mean, I don't know that much about movie making. I'm pretty sure when they made the Ten Commandments, we knew that the Israelites were going to get out of Egypt. And even though we're waiting with bated breath to see, which plague is going to soften Pharaoh's heart, we know none of them will until the end. But it's still an interesting story. And actually, what I'm even thinking of is more. I have no problem watching movies over and over again. Really, I mean, the movie I keep thinking of, the scariest movie I ever saw is The Shining.
Oh.
I remember watching that in the basement alone.
Ay, ay,
Um,
ay.
and if I watched it again, I would still find it as quite as scary because we know how it's going to end. But you still can get into it because in the movie, the characters have free will. And even though you're begging, I always talk about the sweet young thing that's going to open, trying to figure out, should I go in this old house or should I go home like my dad told me to? And you're watching this movie and she's going toward the door, and behind the door is the guy with the hockey mask and the chainsaw. And you're begging her not to open that door, but even though you're pleading and begging, she's gonna do whatever is in the can, whatever is in the movie, it's not going to change. There are some movies now, when you're watching them online, you can actually change the ending, which is kind of a fun thing. But anyway, I don't want to belabor the point. So I will continue reading this article and see if maybe we've made all the points we need to make, and see whether the remainder is interesting. But I do think it's sort of interesting to see how, I guess the major point here is how varied the theology of Judaism is. And these are variations that still are crucial to the way people understand God and understand Judaism, and they are at odds with each other. I would say, again, I'm always talking about this idea that for Judaism, the significant thing isn't what you believe, but what you do. So, both Nachmanides and Maimonides would agree you don't have pork. And you do all the other things, that all the commandments, even though they're very, very widely apart on what the theology is. So I don't know if anyone else has a comment. I see a couple of hands are there. Yeah, Alan.
I think Bryce was ahead of me.
I know Bryce.
Not anymore.
You need to put it down.
Yeah, go ahead.
My comment on you saying the variety of theology sounds easy for me to, as a reform or even conservative Jew, to accept that statement. But would a Orthodox or Chabad rabbi or a Haredi also would you reword that? Would they reword it a little bit?
Would they reword it?
Well, you're expressing, as we did in this article, there's different ways to look at theology.
Right.
Okay, but that's easy for me to do. Is that would a traditional person?
So a traditional Jew would read this article and understand and respect both Maimonides and Nachmanides. The rabbi that approached me in the airport wanted me to put on tefillin because he absolutely believed that my putting on tefillin would heal some of the universe. That was Nachmanides' idea. I don't know that I think Maimonides would be much more rational in his approach. But they would both agree you should put on tefillin.
I mean, there's this principle in the Talmud, maybe would make me buy this a little easier, that it is possible to hold two somewhat different viewpoints at the same time.
Yeah, and they say that arguments for the sake of heaven are worthy, and arguments that are not for the sake of heaven are not worthy. And they use the example of the arguments between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. I can't remember the language, but the arguments of I think it's Dathan and so on in the Exodus. So Jews argue. That's no argument. There's no question about that. The question is, are we arguing for the sake of heaven, for the sake of truth, or are we arguing just to put other people down? And so that I think is an important distinction.
Thank you.
But I think it is interesting and somewhat revealing to realize how varied Jewish views of the nature of God and heaven and commandments are. Yes. And those differences don't cause Judaism to fall apart. Whereas, I would say Christianity is much more focused on proper belief. And if you change your belief structure a little bit, you got to start a new church. And I had a wonderful conversation with an imam recently, and he helped me understand Islam better by saying Islam is in between the two. That belief is very important, but also Islam has a very complex and detailed form of Jewish law, just like we have halakha, they have Sharia, and so both are important. So anyway, I hope you found it interesting. And either we'll continue this discussion, or I'm looking at a couple of other interesting ideas. In fact, one of the things I think I'm going to start doing on Monday nights after I finish with science and religion is Kabbalah. So that should be interesting discussion. Okay, gang, have a good evening.
You too.
and
Good night.
Take care. and
Thank you,
stay well.
Rabbi.
Thank you,
Good
Rabbi.
night, everybody.